So from the moment this one starts, it's a broken piano chord resonating in the absolute silence of the room, just hanging upon the cliff edge of this incredible emotion. Playing around for a little few repeats and essentially just immediately setting the scene for this incredibly emotional, cathartic experience. Something that's actually going to be very difficult to approach. So yeah, essentially today we're looking at a rather peculiar album. This is, for me, an incredibly haunting experience that I felt like just diving into and talking about, especially after feeling a bit of a dip in depression over the past few weeks, I'm going to say. As always during these times, I turn to the emotional resonance of music, essentially, and I found myself turning to basically one of the most cathartic experiences in music I think I've come across. Typically, this is not the best place to start with anybody involved in this. Like, we should have talked about Godspeed You Black Emperor ages ago, but alas, I just never got around to it, so I haven't. Regardless, I want to discuss this one, because this is an album that is very special to me, and the time just felt right to finally start talking about it. So, today I present He Has Left Us Alone, but sometimes shafts of light grace the corners of our room, by a Silver Mount Zion. Well, who are a Silver Mountain Zion? Silver Mountain Zion, or the Silver Mount Zion Memorial Orchestra, and many other variations of the name. It's kind of seen as an offshoot from Godspeed You Black Emperor, led by Ephraim Manuel Menick, project that spanned the years of 2000 to 2014. And the project, especially in those later years, it offered a much more lyrical approach to things, taking the template of post-rock aesthetics, applying it to Ephraim's headspace, and giving these incredibly anti-war sentiments that still ring very true to this day. And over the years, there's been many people coming and going from the band, beautifully expanding upon the sonic palette in very amazing ways and creating a wonderful, varied and extensive discography of music. However, today we are looking at He Has Left Us Alone, but sometimes Shaft of Life grace the corners of our room. The band's debut album, released in 2000 on Constellation Records as its 9th official release. And this version of the band actually only had 3 members, or official members. You had Ephraim Manuel Menick on guitar, organ, piano, electronics, brackets radio, and vocals, Sophie Trudeau on violin and voice, and Thierry Amat on bass and double bass. And this core lineup of just 3 of them, it resulted in a very sparse, minimalist experience for the most part, anchored around Sophie's exquisite violin performances and these incredibly spacious pianos scattered throughout, all backed up by these wonderful low-end rumbles from Thierry. There is a couple of guests briefly appearing on certain songs here and there, expanding the sound in very phenomenal, amazing ways, with it all resulting in what is an absurdly bleak and harrowing album experience that just shakes me to my very core. This is an album I've been listening to well over a decade, maybe even 2 decades by this point, which is actually very weird to think about, just how long I've held this album in my life, essentially. A disturbing yet achingly beautiful experience, so let's, of course, dive into it. So opening up with Broken Chords Can Sing a Little. As mentioned, from the moment this one has started, you're just immediately met with this incredibly harrowing and emotional experience. What we have is this incredibly emotional weight that opens it all up, just expressed to us through these very brief little motifs played on the piano, emphasised by so much silence around the corners of those resonating notes. A motif that slightly rises up and up before descending with this incredibly heavy broken chord, essentially. And from here, the album slowly and glacially opens up though, taking that piano and dragging it through the empty spaces and notes ping out with their unusual resonating qualities. And the more it all develops, the more it seems the piano starts to pull out this melody out of itself, travelling over the notes as we get faint sounds of movement across the piano, helping to fill up that silence. But it's in the tune that the piano is playing that you have yourselves confronting this incredible and weighty emotion. Something really heavy and powerful in the form of just a simple piano playing, essentially. All the minor keys expressing this incredible darkness, this form of emotion that hangs so heavily upon your heart, it feels. It is an opening that captures the aesthetic the whole album will be opting for, one that is very difficult to approach as a listener, as it just feels so dark and devastating, essentially. But it's a perfect expression of something that feels so... It's in that expression of something so devastating that I find it to be remarkable. Before long, though, it does end up falling into a bit more of an avant-garde area, though, utilising a recording of some preacher, speaking their sermon as the piano backs it up with these descending notes. And what's remarkable is the sound palette here, as behind it all is the odd abstraction of notes just warping and twisting with unusual ways, these odd little frequencies that seem to be capturing the recording alongside it. Sort of that use of the radio knobs and buttons in there. And it comes across as rather ominous and, dare I say, a little bit disturbing at times. But it then enters that powerful sense of melancholy once more when the violin comes in, pulling on these singular notes that drag so heavily across the strings of the instrument, once again just capturing that sense of disturbing melancholy. And ends up creating this sense of confusion as we become aware of another field recording, playing alongside the other, giving us two voices just speaking out against the backdrop of these hauntingly beautiful instrumentals. It's a whirlwind that, at its core, actually feels oddly minimal, but it perfectly opens up the whole album, opting to play the saddest sounding music ever. Music that is desperate to be heard, but unable to really carry itself out of the depressing weight of emotion. And I think, without a doubt, probably one of the most perfect album openers I think I've ever come across, something that starts off everything at the exact right level, presenting something that feels visceral with just how sad it sounds, and as a result, something that's always resonated with me whenever I've sat down to listen to it. It's an album that, whenever I've been feeling particularly down and depressed, I can always turn to this one to just sort of match the mood I'm experiencing at the time, and as a result, it is a difficult one to approach, but a powerful experience that ranks as one of, the most amazing things I think I've heard. To go back to the composition, though, it's been building up and up, and it ends on a very peculiar note, though, because towards the very tail end of it, after you've had this incredibly haunting procession of instrumentals from the band and those very old recordings, the instrumentals all taper off, and it leaves just those audio samples to continue playing, essentially, intertwining over one another for a rather odd length of time that ends up creating a sense of apprehension, cautiously anticipating what's going to be following as we listen to the garbled sound of voices speaking of religion and war, essentially, with it all ending on this emphasised notion of we are the children of light, which is kind of repeated in both channels, it feels. But it's by this point we've actually effortlessly glided into the next track of Sit in the Middle of Three Galloping Dogs, which follows on from those recordings alongside the presence of what feels like delayed guitar coming through one of the channels, just chugging away essentially with this really amazing texture, before you then get some drums giving us this very unsettling beat played by the one and only Aidan Gert of Godspeed You Black Emperor, of course. It all paves the way for the violin, though, to play such a tragic loop over the top of it all. And as opposed to the absolute crushing depression of the first track, here it feels as though everything has become way more tense, opting to instead express this very disturbing image of the world, it seems, the calamities of war, perhaps, which is always a concern with the band, of course, right? And their ethos in so many of their projects as well, of course. It results in something that does feel very akin to the likes of Godspeed You Black Emperor, of course, but a lot more minimal for the most part, which is why I think it's probably so fascinating. It really just lets the violin express the anxiety here, as the guitar just creates this bed of noise behind it all, and as it progresses, it sort of builds up to this very cautious and anxious level of anxiety, before devolving into this very fervent moment. The drums just going wild as the violins just become, incredibly tragic over the top of it all, though. And there's something so haunting and beautiful about the whole thing, like watching all of this chaos and destruction happening all around you, and feeling completely powerless to do anything about it, essentially. It is an incredibly resonating moment, one that expresses this sense of panic and turmoil as it all occurs. And it's such a fervent moment that pushes the album from something that's strictly depressing to something that is impactfully emotional. Like, I find myself just drawn to the whole experience whenever I sit down to listen to it all, just finding myself pulled by those emotions that the band are expressing with the music, carried to these very dark and sometimes disturbing places as a result. Hence why, though, that it's such a phenomenal album in my books, as mentioned. In any case, though, as it's all progressing, the album moves effortlessly into the next track once again, of Stumble and then Rise on Some Awkward Morning. And following that trail left behind by the delayed guitars and the violins, what opens this one up is this very dark set of chords on the piano, sounding so far away, essentially, just in the distance as they play this repeating, descending motif. And after a few loops of that, after it brings this back into that silence once more, you get this very powerful performance from the violin, accompanied by these dense rumbles from the instruments, which is maybe Thierry's bass here, perhaps, I'm not so sure. On the ending of each and every loop, though, punctuated by this final note from the piano. Like, the whole palette here it's almost simplistic, it's very few little brief motifs, but it really gets to me each and every time I hear it, though. Like, it's kind of like this culmination of the two previous tracks, where you've had the heavy weight of emotion expressed tenfold in the form of this really tragic sounding composition. And what truly elevates this one is the looping of violin parts from Sophie, allowing her to add some incredible backing drones to the composition, as it's all occurring essentially, by which point you've got Ephraim just descending these very few sparse notes which become backed up by Sophie as well. Like, from that sort of set of chords that opens it up, it just goes bum bum dum dum bum bum ba dum, just descending down like that in this incredibly beautiful way that just, I don't know why, it just breaks me every time I hear it, though. There's such a weighty, impactful emotion that feels so incredibly tragic and almost incomprehensible to me, and how it effortlessly glides from that opening to this sort of middle section, essentially, just this everything just falling into turmoil. Like, it's amazing because it all becomes so much more nervous and tense the more it's all pushing forth, essentially. Like, I should say, there is an incredible beauty to it all, though, and especially to this one, but it's one that is so steeped in that incredible cathartic emotion at the same time. Like, there's something very unexplainable, but something oddly relatable as well. Like, I feel like it's so much in part to what Sophie is playing here, you know, this melody that travels all over her violin, joining that descent into this disturbing level of emotion that feels so unsettling, of course. Like, especially when it just seems to collapse alongside those brief notes on the piano, though, it's just one of my favourite things from this whole album. Though truth is, the whole thing is my favourite. Every single song on this all adds up to something that is truly breathtaking and amazing. Like, the journey from start to end is just this incredible thing, and the more it navigates from scene to scene, the more you're pulled into that incredibly dark and harrowing story that they're all presenting, essentially. And especially on this particular one, when you get that cascade that occurs towards the tail end of it, of course, I just find it so impactful, and it just hangs on my heart as it's all occurring, leaving me just feeling so bitter and melancholy as the music itself. But oddly enough, as weird as that is, I adore it for that, though. As mentioned, it's one of those things that when I feel the need to listen to this, I am just so easily pulled by the weight of emotion being expressed by the band, as it just seems to tap into my headspace that my mind is occupying, supporting my feelings as I allow the tragedy to just take over. It's the kind of thing I'm actually very grateful for, and although it doesn't make sense to much people, I personally find the sense of cathartic emotion to be just a truly wonderful and powerful thing. Like, it just floors me each and every time I hear it, especially this whole album, of course, right? And it's the kind of thing that I feel drawn to in these rather depressing moments in my life. Like, it's maybe hence why I wanted to review this one at this particular point in time. Like, I always find the navigation of depression to be a very sort of like peaks and troughs kind of thing. You get your moments where it's easy to navigate, you're sort of on those highs, and then other times you're back in those troughs and everything is just so just difficult to manage and difficult to really approach and difficult to experience, essentially. And when I find myself in these states of mind, I always turn to the music that feels as broken and bitter as my sense of self, perhaps, if that makes any sense. Like, it's a very difficult thing to explain, but especially just feeling rather down in these current weeks, I felt it was time to come back to this album, to experience that sense of catharticism and incredible emotion that is imparted upon by the three of them here, essentially. Like, very weird to explain to people, but I imagine some people out there would get it. Moving along, though, we do have one final song for side A, which is all collectively known as Lonely as the Sound of Lying on the Ground of an Airplane Going Down, I should have mentioned. The last track in this suite, Movie Never Made. Here we have a very powerful song. A vocal performance from Ephraim, this paean to his own understanding of the state of the world, it seems. And there's something so beautifully tragic and poetic about the lyrics written here. Something that feels so impactful and as relevant today as when it was first written. Opening essentially with a reference to both the band name and to a specific hill located outside of Jerusalem, which is a point of conflict for the still continuing war between Israel and Gaza. It perhaps ties together those constant concerns of currently ongoing war, which at the time was ongoing and to this day is still ongoing, right? It feels remarkable to me because this was written all the way back in 2000, but it predates that by decades, of course, doesn't it? But across the lyrics, you're being confronted with what I'd argue is this sort of leftist counterculture of Jewish identity, perhaps, crying out in absolute agony and pain over what is occurring in their name, you know, despite their resistance to it. And as such, it suggests so much that perhaps should be done, you know, joining together to take down the ones who are truly damaging this world beyond repair, in the name of greed and selfishness, essentially. It's perhaps in the second verse. There's so much beautiful emphasis to what's being sung in the form of the double bass by Thierry here. Like, he just backs it all up with this very sort of slightly jazzy aesthetic, and it really pushes forward those anti-capitalist notions essentially before it all navigates to the penultimate verse, where here it's backed up by the haunting strings from Sophie. And it's such an impactful song here. Like, this one feels like such a direct result of the vocals used in the track being directly addressed by Ephraim as he lays out everything he feels across the table. His exact thought process and understanding of the horrors of this world that we're currently existing in. I find it fascinating and amazing and impactful. Like, this song that kind of buckets itself with those sparse pianos, bass on the second verse, violins for the third, before going back to the sparse minimalism at the piano for the final. All the while expressing this incredibly powerful rhetoric. And because it's so direct is perhaps why it feels so distinctly impactful to me. Something that just captures my own misery and dismay at the state of the world, though much better and more eloquently than I could ever manage. Like, the way Ephraim's worded this one is truly spectacular. But as mentioned, what amazes me is the relevance that it has in this current day and age, of course. The ongoing conflict between Palestine and Israel has always been a concern for Ephraim and his friends, of course, even expressed as recently on the last Godspeed You Black Emperor album, of course. Some 26 years later, this album was released. It's more of the same, more of that agonising genocide as the ultra-elite line their pockets with the profits of war, essentially. Like, I'm not an academic, I don't know much about it all, but I know I'm furious about it, and the greed and destruction of human life is just sickening. And all I can say is God bless Ephraim, Sophie and Thierry and everyone involved here for placing this song here. You know, something that ties together the heavy weights of emotion we've experienced thus far, ending side A on such a difficult and dark note. Like, it just has me considering everything. Like, after such a long amount of time, all of this is still going on. And, like, did it ever get any better? Well, fuck, no, of course it didn't. It's still as fucking horrible as it always has been. And is it going to get any better? Like they say in, the Godspeed to Black Emperor track, you think things are going to get better before they get worse? Like, no, man. Like, it's all just getting worse. Maybe that's why I feel so bitter, though. Who knows? Moving along. You flip over the vinyl. Side B, which is collectively known as The World Is 6-6, so kiss me quick. Side A, dark and harrowing and almost disturbing experience, partnered up with that constant beauty in the music, of course, right? A very odd thing, but here on side B is when it transforms into something truly spectacular. Side B opens up with 13 angels standing guard around the side of your bed, opening up with this affected sampled wail of sorts, adding in its own level of ambience as it occurs, looping over and over and over with this very small semblance of melody occurring as a result of its looped pattern. A small rise, a further descent, and back again, and just coming in and out like these breaths of air, essentially. The more it loops over, the more faint elements start to appear, like these little droning layers, guitars capturing the smallest semblances of notes and delaying them in these very unusual shapes, as well as the gentle pulse of the bass guitar adding in this heartbeat, before you then get some of the most gentle and existential and just phenomenal sounding violin from Sophie. Like, the way she just plays it is just some of the most hauntingly beautiful thing, and it just really gets to me every time I listen to it and think about it. It's just one of the most powerful things. Like, she just plays over this incredibly mournful melody that is just tragically hanging on these incredibly existential notes. And as she plays it more, she loops it over and over to let the low register of the violin be heard, and it truly transforms into one of the most tragically beautiful things I've ever heard. Like, one of those songs that shakes me to my core each and every time I hear it. Like, incredibly minimalist notions, all built around those sampled vocal layers, themselves shrouded in mystery, actually. Like, at times it was believed to be the sound of cats wailing, and then believed to actually be the sounds of angels themselves. So I'm somewhat more certain that the sounds are actually sampled vocals from the band, from Efren and Sophie and maybe Thierry, but I'm not 100% sure, of course. Like, goodness, this forms the crux of this song here, essentially. And it's one of those things I always find to be so powerfully existential. Like, whenever this one arrives, and I'm diving into it, I just feel really raw and rough, Here is where I hang my head, I just allow myself to be transported into that inexplainable headspace. This incredibly haunting and ethereal experience that feels like being witness to the emergence of a ghost, perhaps. Phenomenal, and I remember when I first heard this album, this was maybe 17 years ago, I think. I tried to do the math, and I think it's around 17 years, which I'm not sure if it is that, roughly about that, but it's when I first heard this particular song, I remember being completely blown away by the powerful sense of catharticism that comes through the music itself. Experiencing something so incredibly powerful that just feels otherworldly, essentially. And it's perhaps in use of that constantly repeated unusual vocal loop, sounding like haunting breaths backed up by the incredible instrumentals that feel like a eulogy to the fallen. It encompasses an understanding and consideration of death, it feels, which is probably why it's so disturbing to hear. Maybe also feels like that in part to its incredible name, this image of angels surrounding your bed as you experience those final moments of life, all there to protect you as they guide you on. Like something that feels inexplainable, an inability to comprehend the beings surrounding you and that are there to keep you safe. It is one that has always stuck with me for such an incredibly long length of time, and even to this day still managed to achieve that same level of cathartic existentialism. A final note I would be remiss not to mention, though, it's a bit of more of an amusing note, actually, but it's quite interesting in what is now a part of the history of this song. The fact of the TikTok trend that this track ended up forming. So I'll be honest, I don't use TikTok. I'm well out of the loop for anything that goes viral, It's not something I keep track of, essentially, nor do I really care, to be truth be told. I don't... it's fine if that's what people are interested in, but it's never stood out to me as something I want to check out. But I did come across the concept that this was making the rounds on TikTok at some point. Essentially, the story goes, the song was making the rounds on TikTok, which was branded as the sound of literal angels, causing a widespread of reactions from mostly young people who had never heard the song or the band before. Their reactions range from so many different things, bemusement, and bewilderment. But it made me really think about a lot of things. If you had never heard of the band, this album, or this song, what would you think the context is for something that sounds this way? And it's why the reactions from people who end up discovering it, so some 25 years on from when this album's first released, ended up in so many different things, and it's oddly incredible to think about. Their reactions were bemusement, appreciation of the beauty of the song, confusion, but even terror to some people who also felt that sense of existentialism that the music naturally conveys, of course. It's interesting to me because the context of understanding is different for these people. They didn't come across it as a result of listening to this album. They came across it through TikTok, through this branding of the literal sound of angels. And some people choosing to believe in that fact, gives it such an interesting contextualization. But I think that's kind of neat in of itself, to have discovered something so strange in such a way. And a part of me likes to think that the more curious people maybe did go out to check it out, further dive into what the heck this was. And maybe even discovering the band and the album in the process, and maybe even finding the whole thing emotionally communicating them as a result. Who knows? Everybody is different. Some people probably heard it and didn't like it. Some people may adore it, but everyone is different, right? But I like to think so, that somebody out there is now found because of that. And I think that's actually kind of a neat thing. But who knows? Who knows? Just a weird tangent there. There's another track 6, Long March Rocket or Doomed Airliner. 5 seconds of one final loop of that vocal. Bookend, consideration of the imagery perhaps, if I kind of feel like it's one final breath before they truly fade away. Very cool. What's interesting though is how it's only 5 seconds, but on the notes here for the physical release, It's listed as being 4 minutes long, as well as the previous track. They combined both together. But the previous track contains the whole thing, and this only gives us one final little vocal wail. Interesting choice to do it, but who knows why they decided to do this one. Like, I guess if you listen to the vinyl version, it doesn't make any difference, does it? It is all just one thing. But interesting nonetheless. Moving along, we get to the next track of Blown Out Joy from Heaven's Mercied Hole. Another phenomenal track. Here we have a very slow bass motif opening all up, resonating in the space as it climbs to hit that top note, as we then get a very brief vocal passage. Don't tell me that I am free, 'cause I have not been well lately. Harmonised by Ephraim and Sophie here, leading the way for some incredibly sparse pianos as the violins just pull these large breaths of air around it all, whilst behind it you've got this growing noise of guitar lines gently following the pulse of the song, and provided by the one and only Sam Shalabi, I should add. From here we end up with a very odd, slightly post-rock minimalist experience that really pushes forth this sense of anxious tension. The violins just travelling all over the instrument, whilst you're kind of getting, from Ephraim those very sparse notes, as, Sam just creates this wonderful melody of guitar parts coming in so bizarrely in the background in the various channels, of course. Some wonderful, his approach to it is just lovely, how he creates these wonderful little moments. And it creates a very slow, long march, essentially, a kind of procession that's led along by the pulse of that bass. This is, like the whole album, another one of my favourites. Like, as mentioned, they are all for their individual reasons. And what I adore about this one is the sort of abstract jazzy template, punctuated by the more unusual moments that break away in the forms and conventions imposed by the melody, essentially. Especially when Sophie descends beautifully on the violin, allowing Ephraim to really tap on the notes of the piano before transforming it into this broken waltz of sorts. Like, there's something very odd about it, refusing to adhere to any traditional template of music, sounding almost Yiddish, I would argue, in terms of its strange tune. But it's also broken, slightly discordant, and backed up by haunting guitar pattern and peculiar breaths from the clarinet provided by Gordon Krieger, by the way, of the band Exhaust, actually. Another contributor to the album as well, actually, just a guest on this one. It's kind of neat, actually, because he's credited as playing a patient clarinet as well, so it comes in so sparsely, but it's very cool. But it's all creating this very unusual musical palette that breaks away from the rest of the album itself, and I adore just how the whole thing comes together, because it's in its inherent strangeness that I find myself so utterly thralled and bewildered. Like, the piano just seems desperate to break itself away from that pulse that the bass is constantly providing, travelling up and down and into a cascade of notes that barely form a melody here, being so beautifully abstract in places. But it's such a beautifully wonderful and unusual vibe, but it's one that moves so glacially, just so slowly as it's pushed along by that repeated bass motif, essentially. But it's always been one of my top favourites from this album. Like I said, they all are. I adore all the many different vibes that each of the songs offer. The first few all interconnected into that one long experience that's very haunting, bleak, and disturbing. And then the last, the last song is doing the same thing in their own world. On the second part, side B. Worlds apart in some respects, I'd say, maybe in terms of how the literal sounds, but in fairness still capturing the ethos of the bands, of their concern and anxiety of the state of the world, essentially, and their existentialism. But it's what I love, though, these very surreal and emotional experiences expressed to us in the form of these instrumental performances. Like, it is truly phenomenal music. It is in the ending, though, I actually get one of my favourite parts of the whole thing. Sophie leads the whole thing into this outro with this lovely little violin motif played in the lower registers, this very beautiful little part that she plays, which cuts through beautifully into the composition as it all starts to fade out, which Ephraim then matches in that customary vocal style of his. And it becomes a brief little outro section that leads us away from the strange anxiety of the entire composition into these final moments, something that feels very tragic and broken, like singing in amongst the ruins and rubble of what lays before you. It is truly spectacular and an absolute highlight of this whole album experience, as it just brings everything all to this very slow, patient, emotional just place of quiet, before it then leads us all into the final track. For Wanda, one final instrumental in tribute to Wanda, Ephraim's dog, who passed away during the Godspeed You Black Emperor tour. So this one opens up with some really high-pitched frequencies from the guitar, it feels. The sound of either laughing or crying way off in the distance, essentially, as we get a very minimalist piano performance echoing back the same sentiments as the opening track, it feels. Very spacious in this resonating space, this hallway echoing out of these brief instances of sound and the presence of humans located on the other side of these rooms. With the tune being played on the piano, it's another heartbreaker, essentially. An incredibly difficult track to really approach due to the bleak nature of the instrumental. Now, those small motifs of the piano just seem to tug on my heart, exasperated by the appearance of that violin that plays a melody similar to 13 Angels, it feels. In this case, another eulogy to the fallen, which in this case is poor Ephraim's dog Wanda. As a closing track, it feels like For Wanda just perfectly culminates the whole experience of the album. You've got sparse pianos, haunting strings, and even some low end on the double bass that beautifully rumbles behind this desperately tragic melody. And it's that bleak expression of existentialism of just carrying with you that sense of grief that is so inexplainable, so unable to really be understood and thus processed in the form of creating this very album here. The song and the whole album is dedicated to Wanda, essentially, and hearing this track you can only imagine just how much Ephraim loved them, essentially. It just adds a further context and understanding of this whole album that makes it unlike anything I've ever heard before. Something that does nearly bring me to tears each and every time I hear it. Like, not just this song, but the whole album just nearly brings me to tears. Like, it just breaks me every time I hear it. But before we close off, there's actually a final moment on this track, though. The last minute of this track actually offers up a peculiarity in the form of this very gentle little drone played from the organ, probably. A kind of little melody played in a church, perhaps, which feels very gentle and serene, feeling, charmingly ambient and kind of offering us this very peaceful place to lie and rest. As though after everything we have experienced, the terror, the tragedy, and the crushing weight of existentialism, we have found our resting place in the form of this beautiful little organ drone that briefly closes off the entire thing. Almost forgotten in regards to the whole album as a whole, like I can never remember this part as here, But when it comes, it's so beautifully appreciated because it just allows everything to just sort of calm down to a nice place of settlement to let us finish off the whole thing. Like, what an incredible and beautiful album this is. Like, as mentioned, it's the kind of thing that just breaks me whenever I hear it. Like, weirdly enough, talking about it has been getting me a bit emotional in places as well. I didn't think that would happen, but it's just the nature of making these episodes. They come out however they do, don't they? But yeah, it's just like I said as well. It's one of those things where whenever I'm feeling raw and rough, I'll put this one on. Whenever depression is getting to that overwhelmingly crushing weight and I feel dragged down by everything, I can always return to this album here, resulting in an experience that is almost horrifically cathartic. It's something I've mentioned on certain devastating albums, and it's not something that everyone can make sense of, but for myself, it does make sense. It does make sense. It's something that makes so much sense to me. Like, it makes sense to match my mood with music that is as bleak as I'm feeling, as it makes me feel less alone and maybe more receptive to the emotional catharsis that the music's offering. Maybe that's a part of it. But to kind of go off on it again, it's why this particular album is so fascinating though. Like, the fact that this album is so easily able to express that incredible complex set of emotions, the inner turmoil we feel when experiencing grief, and to process it by creating these incredibly emotional intense performances, backed up by one song of sorts right in the middle that expresses all of those concerns and worries in the form of actual lyrics. Like, I'm blown away by it. Like, I'm unable to really comprehend it, as I'm just always transported to that headspace, that cathartic experience, and as a result, it's always been one of my favourite things from the band. Like, the genesis of this project in the form of this arguably minimalist, more stripped back version of Godspeed You Black Emperor, perhaps. I mean, of course, with it featuring both members, there's many parallels that are always going to be made, of course. Like, both projects do experience that concern of the world at large, essentially. Though it seems Silver Mountain Zion really allowed Ephraim to really direct everything on a much more personal level, really diving deep into himself to draw out those considerations and worries and concerns, as well, of course, with his grief. And it's why this is so powerful. Grief, I have always found to be one of the most powerful emotions we can experience. And I completely understand the idea of creating music as a way of forming your understanding of grief, using creation to navigate the process, which is why the music tends to be so emotionally charged, because it comes from such an emotionally charged place. One of the many reasons why this album truly astounds me, essentially. Not something I can listen to all the time, but it's always there when I need to immerse myself in it. Just truly powerful emotional music. And so I think with that, we will come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. A strange one for me to have talked about, but something about the timing just kind of felt right for this one, which is why we're going to have this episode out. I mean, like I said, I've been meaning to discuss Godspeed, Set Fire to Flames, and all the other Godspeed offshoots and bands and projects eventually on this show. And Godspeed is well overdue, I'm sorry, but for some reason I found myself drawn to Silver Mountain Zion, drawn to discussing one of the most harrowing experiences within the whole subset of experimental Canadian music, I would argue. A spectacular album that I rank as one of the absolute best things I've ever heard. Truly powerful emotional music. So yeah, if you've made it this far, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. Another one for the Devastating Albums playlist, of course. Not the easiest playlist to expand upon, but it's getting there. We'll see. For now, I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.